Just before we dive back into the episode, I wanted to quickly share something that might interest you, especially if today's conversation has got you thinking about your own sustainability work. Some of the things we hear most in this industry are, I wish I could connect with other people doing this work, or I'd love to turn my sustainability expertise into something more. Well, 51 to Carbon Zero, the sponsor of this podcast, have created their own referral network. And it does exactly that. This isn't about selling you something, it's actually about helping you make money while building the sustainability community we all need. So here's what's in it for you. First, you get to join a genuine community of sustainability experts who share knowledge, refer work to each other, and solve problems together. So, no more working in isolation. Secondly, there's real money involved. There's 10% plus commission on software referrals. We're talking about projects that go from 30 grand up to 100 grand. Plus, you'll be able to boost your presence by taking part in our fireside chats. I've actually got an email in front of me from Louise Stevens, one of the ambassadors, and it says that all her clients are genuinely happy because she's got a great partner and her clients love them. But here's the bigger picture. You'll be helping accelerate the sustainability transition that we all desperately need. Every referral, every connection, every collaboration moves us closer to the world we're all working towards. If this resonates with you and you want to earn some extra income, click the link in our show notes to become a 51 to Carbon Zero ambassador. Okay, back to the show. Hi and welcome to Sustainability Solved, the Sustainable Business Podcast. I'm Will Richardson, the founder and CEO of the Green Element Group, incorporating Green Element, Compare Your Footprint, and of course Sustainability Solved. We've been empowering organisations to manage their environmental impacts for a just and sustainable world since 2004.
And I'm Charlie Luxton, an architectural designer who focuses on sustainable housing. Last night, the winners of the longest running awards programme in the UK were announced. The Housing Design Awards were established in 1948 in the same sitting of Parliament as the NHS to identify the best ideas among councils' post-war rebuild. 76 years later, the awards serve to highlight and celebrate good design practice in building and to encourage knowledge sharing. With sustainability increasingly at the forefront of housing design, we are talking to two of the judges about last night's winners and the trends and innovations in the built environment more generally. David Birkbeck is the Managing Director of Design for Homes, who runs the awards, and Richard Williams is the Development Manager of Velux, who have been the corporate partner of the awards since 2020. So welcome to you both. First of all, who won?
12 schemes won.
Was there an overall?
Yeah, there's an overall winner, which is a very lovely senior housing development in Bermondsey, which you just look at and think, I hope I could end up living there.
And so 12 different schemes in all different categories, I assume, to try and sort of bring together and tell a story about where we're trying to go with housing and improving housing design. Is that kind of a big part of your remit?
The awards are there to try and find the examples of what aren't being built today that other people should look at and copy. So it's essentially a kind of way of researching almost like new drugs in order to produce something 4 or 5 years down the road on a mass market.
So should we just spin back? Who organises and runs these awards? I mean, who's the kind of the people behind it? And what is you mentioned the ambition of trying to sort of stimulate the very best, but maybe you could sort of fill us out a bit on that.
The government sets up the awards and the government remains the principal player behind the awards. There is a group of people, essentially a coalition of all the key interests in the sector behind them. So you have the 3 professional institutes for the 3 professions, the surveyors through the RICS, the architects through the RIBI, and the planners through the RTPI. And then you've got other parties that are interested.
Sorry, what does RTBI, what does RBI, what do all these acronyms mean, please?
Surveyors have an institute called the RICS. Planners are represented through an institute called the RTPI, and architects through an institute called the RIBA.
So the RICS is the Royal Institute for Chartered Surveyors. My brother's a chartered surveyor, so I know that one. What's the other one, please?
You got the Royal Town Planning Institute.
Okay.
And Royal Institute of British Architects.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Interestingly, the RICS is actually the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors.
Okay.
So, and I don't know why, because I thought an institution was like a mental hospital.
Moving swiftly on, could you tell us who the government still fund it? I mean, that seems quite extraordinary that the government over 70 or 80 years have been funding this awards. It seems pretty unusual.
The government gets a coalition of the great and the willing to put money behind it, and they fund individual outputs. So you'll see, for example, the films are paid for through one government body, and the website is paid for by the Department for Communities. But essentially, the process of searching out the schemes and visiting them and dragging 20-odd people on the road, that is paid for through a mixture of entry income and sponsorship from companies like Velux and those professional institutes.
Okay, fantastic. And how important has sustainability become a focus for these awards? And how have you sort of seen that change over the last decade or so?
It's become something which is now a given. There was a time when we used to give awards to schemes that were sustainable on the grounds that weren't they brave and going somewhere where no one had been before and trying really hard. We don't have to do that anymore. We're not using the awards as this kind of sort of early sort of herald of what you should be thinking about process with sustainability, because everybody's thinking about it. But I think the most important thing in the last couple of years has been the sudden focus on biodiversity, and essentially the sense that when you build something, it's better if it's very, very green in sense of the environment it builds around the housing and the biophilic benefits of that, and how that manages things like climate change, rather than it just having an energy performance, which is increasingly regulated.
And by biophilic, you mean the fact that being around living ecosystems makes us feel better?
Yes, exactly so. I think you'll be surprised if you looked at some of the plans and layouts of these schemes, because you'd look at them and you'd go, do you realize that about 60% of this is landscape, water, and we're looking at developments. They're essentially swapping out a lot of the stuff that used to be lost to the hard surface of the road and the car, and we're replacing it with something that would actually sustain biodiversity.
And I also find that there's a huge challenge, isn't there, of actually trying to reduce the amount of hard standing from highways engineers and parking standards. And, once you get outside of London or outside of Oxford or the main cities, the requirements of parking standards are still incredibly high, parking numbers are incredibly high. And it's really hard to drive down the hard surface, isn't it?
Well, it's not so hard as we thought. You just got to have a benign landowner that will take a view on that. So, for example, just outside of Oxford, you've got Woodstock. Now, the family that own that, the Blenheim estate, just the Duke of Marlborough and that amazing Vanbrugh Palace, he is building a development that's a winner this year. And one of the things that they've done is they've taken the car out of the actual street and they've put it in barns and in courts, where essentially people now, they don't live in a road with a road surface where their car comes down the road and parks in front of their home. They live in a green lane and they walk 10 meters to where their cars are parked in barns. So there are tactics that are emerging. There's a scheme in Lewes. Lewes is a hotbed of environmental progress, and there is a development which is being run by a developer that was set up by Britain's Greenpeace founders, and that development will have about 700 homes where all the car parking will essentially be to one particular mobility hub, where it will be shared with all the people using things like the shops and the cafes within the development. and it won't be parked on the street in front of the homes.
We've just completed a 12-person affordable housing scheme in our village, and we had 9 consultations working with the local community through a community land trust. And that was a really interesting process. We started off with very simple, right at the beginning, of talking about layout, going, well, would you like to have a small house sat with a small garden all around it, like the large PLC developers do? Or, would you like to try other things? And it's very interesting. You ask these questions and you dread the fact that they'll say, no, we want what the developers deliver, the majority of developers deliver. But when you start those conversations, it's very quick that people end up going, oh, right, so we could have more shared communal space and just park in parking yards. And you're like, yeah. And they're like, yeah, we'll have that. And you go, if you have terraces, they could be cheaper to run and cheaper to build. They're like, yeah, we like to say that. We'll have that. And suddenly, out of a conversation, a very different form appears, doesn't it? A very different form of living.
It does. And the big challenge, and the awards obviously research these things in order to promote these ideas, but they have to offer solutions. The big challenge is finding a landowner to say, look, if all this environment we're going to give you with all this wonderful landscape architecture is going to improve your life and make you live longer and make you happy, we also have to demonstrate how we're going to pay for it. And, in the case of the Woodstock scheme, which is called Hill Rise, the Blenheim estate has taken the view, well, if it costs more to maintain it, we'll maintain it. We have a management company that maintains one of the biggest palaces in the world. We can stretch that to looking after a nice housing development built alongside it.
But also, I think it's about challenging that disconnect and boundary between sort of countryside good, housing development bad from a biodiversity sort of point of view. But we actually know that well-designed urban areas have a higher biodiversity than standard farm landscapes by a long chalk, don't they? So actually, it's about maybe challenging a lot of the perceptions about how and where we build.
It's about, I think, also making connections. I mean, essentially, you have to think about these developments as creating a series of stepping stones for creatures to make their way from one area of, say, rich woodland that existed to another through the new development. Now, if you introduce a load of really hard car parking treatments and roads and pavements, then, your little bird is not going to be able to make its 5-minute leaps as a fledgling from one woodland to the next. So if you build these things like stepping stones through it, so you have these pockets of green spaces, not dedicating everything as a single great big sort of Regency public open space square, but creating these little pockets, then you are effectively creating a route through these new developments for biodiversity.
Richard, we've heard a couple of David schemes that he's referenced. Were there some winners that you found particularly exciting and relevant to your position from Velux?
Yeah, there were. When we look at it from my perspective, I looked at it in the eyes of somebody else, where I look at light, natural ventilation, and a design layout. And there's a couple I could probably sort of share with you, if I may. One was the Alcon Gateway. And one thing I liked about that, we talk about sort of choices. This was down in Ebbsfleet, down in Kent. And essentially, there were 67 homes, of which 25% were affordable. The one thing I like about this is, take away the aesthetics and the architecture from that perspective, is that they gave a choice to the client. There may be about 4 or 5 different types, so they could either zip up a room or unzip a room. So what that did allowed you to adapt the individual family or families to what their stage of life is. So if you've got a young couple in there, they may want more open space living, and they could either, like I say, zip up the room or close the room sort of down. And I think that was really, really sort of nice concept. And I think that when it comes to design, I think sometimes we have to think of the people who are within those homes, or indeed sort of buildings that we work and live and play within, and what they are doing their desire, as to basically just say, here's the same thing, and we're sort of copy and repeat, Lego blocks down the line, really. And the other aspect I really quite liked about that, they had a community app. And we spoke earlier, or David spoke earlier, about sort of roadways and pathways, but they had an uninterrupted walkway and cycle route. And the app provided or encouraged children, as an example, if they were to walk to school, they would attain different points. and then those points could go towards a discounted shop purchase or whatever. And that really gets people on the outdoors far more. And that's something from our perspective within Velux, we're really, really keen to highlight. We would say we are the indoor generation. And what I mean by that, we spend an alarming 90% of our time indoors. If you flip it around another way, Charlie, we only spend 2 hours 40 outside, and yet we get 90% of vitamin D from the sun. So that correlation's not there. To actually encourage people to get out there, a bit like the scheme in Woodstock, to get people out there walking to their vehicle for whatever period of time that is, that was one aspect which I think is lovely. The other aspect, which for me was not too far away from sort of London in Bermondsey, it was the Appleby Blue almshouses. And this for me is really, really fundamental. It was basically highlighted by a United St. Saviour's charity, and it meant that the residents of which were going to be 65 years old and above in central London were able to live in that area, which was sort of partly funded or discounted by the charity themselves. And that's really important from our perspective within Velux. People may or may not know that 90% of our profits go back into society. And I think that when you have that kind of model, it's really, really lovely. And one thing I really liked about this particular scheme, it brought the outside inside. And the scheme boasts an amazing residential roof garden where high-level planters offering facilities to grow vegetables, and that was morphed by really desirable planting and benches so people could sit out and relax on a terraced area. But probably more importantly, when they came out there of their flat, there was a walkway, quite a large, expansive walkway internally, where there was a lovely sort of timber bench and a planter next to them. And there was a glazed screen that was openable that they could look down into the garden area. So they're seeing people, if they didn't really want to socialize, they didn't really have to, but they could engage with that community on this internal courtyard. And for me, it goes back to what good design is. I sometimes take away the aesthetics, which obviously clearly is important, but you drink tea, I drink coffee. What some people might like, other people may loathe. But I think good design and good quality is having the heart of people in mind. And I think there were two schemes that, for me, stood out in a really, really good way.
Do you think there's an element that we've actually got stuck in an argument around aesthetics at the loss of actual functionality about, I mean, you're alluding to designing houses that are sort of loose fit, max use that sort of change according to your life requirements. Life's a long time, kids come and go, mobility comes and goes. Do you think there has been an element that our mass housing, our developer-led housing has sort of stalled at the argument about what it looks like, or do we build or do we not build, and not got into the nuance of what does good look like, work like, how does it function? Absolutely.
I think there is and I have to be careful how I sort of do this with sort of large-scale house builders, but I think there's lack of sort of design and choice. And as you mentioned before, when something's positioned to you, would you like this? Is yes, or would you like this? And I think if you take a step back, my previous life, I was an architect's technician down in the Cotswolds. The first thing we used to do when you go onto any site is look at the light. And natural light is so important. And I think it's perhaps underestimated how we feel what it does to us. It's probably the most important ingredient, I think, of any design. It changes throughout the day. It affects us all. And I guess the first thing you do, you look at your compass and see the orientation and where that's planned. And you really want to maximize that day space to get that lovely light coming into, because it stimulates motion from that perspective. And I think the other aspect as well is, as I mentioned before, natural ventilation. At the moment, the last few years, we've been closing buildings in for energy, so passive house kind of aspect. And we're trying to sort of promote active house principles, which allows the building to breathe, live and breathe as we sort of do. And I guess when you look at basically Georgian buildings, I don't know, from 1700s to 1800s, we can see symmetry and proportion, the ratio and heights of the windows, which will correlate with the room sizes. And yet now when we look at the size of windows is being reduced because maybe part overheating, and we're trying to say, well, we want to promote more glass, and more people would like more daylight and fresh air, but actually the industry is sort of trying to close that down because of overheating, but we can sort of basically get around that. I think so. I think those aspects really, I think that's good design and good design layout also, because again, as we mentioned before, Charlie, the colour of the bricks or the cladding, it's you drink tea, I drink coffee. But I think that when you look at actually how we're going to use the flow, the circularity space, and the proportion of size of rooms, many rooms you go into, we're probably the only country in the whole of Europe who sells a house on, I've got 4 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, or 5 bedrooms. But it doesn't tell us anything about the space that we're living within. And I think that's one thing I think fundamentally we could perhaps challenge.
What do the rest of Europe sell their houses on if it's not bedrooms? I didn't know that.
They sell it on square meters or square foot. And what's interesting, if you look at any building, the first people say, well, how much do you have? And it's going to cost X amount per square foot or square meter. And yet I think in commercial buildings, we sell it per square foot or square meter. And yet when we buy the biggest expense of our lives, a 25, probably more, 30, 40-year mortgage nowadays, we buy something, it's got 3 bedrooms, but some of those bedrooms, you can just put a desk in. And I think the way we're living today, especially post-COVID, we're living closer together, but yet further apart. And community and bringing communities together is really, really important. And the way we're using our homes now, some of us working from home, 3 out of 5 times a week. And so the space required now is going to be different. We're all probably now in sort of different aspects in different rooms now. And some people now, it's 24 hours in a day. We sleep 8 hours in a day. And some people have a desk in their bedroom and work from that. So they're spending 2/3 of their life in one room. And we really need to think of how we look at that in my eyes.
Very quickly, can I jump in? You said 80%, 90% of the profits from Velux go back into sort of societal benefit. How does that work?
So it's still a family-owned organisation, and they created a foundation, and the foundation has different peers. And so those peers, it could be towards health benefits or looking into different research from that aspect. So part of that process, we have a thing called the Healthy Homes Barometer, and this is basically looking at every year since 2015, we go out to Europe and see, well, what kind of homes and buildings are people living within? And unfortunately, some of the readings is not too good. Poor health is on the increase. COPD and asthma is rising because of poor, damp and unventilated properties. And alarmingly, Charlie, 1 in 3 Europeans now live in a poor indoor environment. And so what we've then sort of tried to do is create a different way of living. So our founder, Willem Kahn Rasmussen, said that one experiment is worth more than 1,000 expert views. And that's exactly what we've done. We've done about 30 different model home experiments over the last 20 odd years. And the latest one, which we're probably most proud of being, is living spaces, which is a concept challenging the way we're building today, which we launched in Copenhagen last year. And I believe David's going to spend some time over there, or has spent some time over there, I should say, within that sort of building. So why are we sort of doing that? I think if you look at it, 37% of global CO2 emissions are within our industry, of which 28% comes from the heating and cooling of buildings. And yet we're closing buildings in. So we're trying to say, well, let's look at what we are building. And there were 5 key principles of what we were doing in living spaces, as an example. One, it had to be healthy, benefiting both people and planet, and bringing the outside in and the inside out. The other had to be shared. We spoke about before about the sense of community and the use of outdoor spaces. When we look at now outdoor spaces, or how many allotments do we have now? So we created a scheme where we probably peppered some allotments within the different schemes. I think the third aspect of the 5 principles of living spaces is simple. Simple modular building system can be either upgraded or repaired. It has to be adaptive, and also has to be scalable. And I think that's one thing that with the demands of the housing in GB&I at the moment, we need to have something so scalable, but they have to be different really as well.
David, what sort of tangible impact do you think the awards have had over the last 30, 40 years, 70 years as it's been running full time? Because I know that Reba and Cabe did a survey. I mean, it's a bit out of date now, probably about 15 years ago, but 74% of people said they would never want to buy a new house, which is a crushing indictment of a failing industry, in my opinion. You might disagree. For the majority of new build housing that's going up in this country, it is substandard. How do you think the awards are actually, changing that?
I think the issue of people not wanting to buy a new house has got a lot to do with people's perception of value. Anything new is automatically 10% more per square foot. And people can spot that. They work it out. They can see that the new builds come with a premium on them. And they also know that they can't really convert them or extend them and try and build any additional equity in them. So I think the majority of the resistance comes from that. I think the awards, though, what they've done is if you just wind the clock back 20 years ago, every apartment building was built so that each room had a single outward facing aspect. The windows in that wall would have been about the size of a TV monitor. And you virtually never had a balcony or an outdoor amenity space like a terrace. You just never found it. Some blocks had penthouses, very few. And then over a period of about 10 years, the awards promoted the idea that if you were going to build at a higher density and use more of your cities for more of your housing redevelopment, that it would be necessary to build accommodation that worked for larger families and which was able to sustain all the lifestyle advantages of houses. And so they started to put in terraces. They started to put in things like shared amenity spaces, roof gardens. And the housing design awards tracked all that, measured it, monitored it, photographed it, showed what it should look like. And then the London plan said, right, we want to regulate this. We recognize that this is actually really important for the health of the nation. We don't think we're going to get families living in 8, 10-story buildings if they haven't got an outdoor space. And then suddenly, a 2 or a 3-bedroom apartment had to have, by planning regulation, a certain amount of balcony space. So it has impacted it. It's also changed the daylighting standards, the expectations. You used to get huge numbers of north-facing apartments with a single window, where people would be in rooms that had almost no daylight. And now that's virtually illegal to build. So that has come about, I think, from the sort of awareness of some of the models that were proposed by the awards being adopted by the people that make the regulations.
So it's a sort of positive feedback, Luke, and you feel that there's a tangible impact that this is having.
I think if you're looking for information on essentially what good practice is, and there is only one database in the whole country where you can go and look at 750 examples of schemes that have been visited by a 20-strong panel, where they've all said, this is a good place to live, and this has got the right things. So these people are not motivated by aesthetics. I was interested in your point about that. Do you think we've been sidetracked? I think we have. I think, we were headed back a couple of months ago into an environment where there was increasing pressure that everything built in England should mimic the 18th and the 19th century. Well, that's just totally irrelevant today. It should be about things like how do we manage climate change? We should be worrying about how do we open our windows to get cross-ventilation strategies? Or how do we increase the quantum of space in our environments that will catch water or moderate temperature bounces that come during heat waves? And those things are not visible in designs from the 18th and the 19th century. In fact, the 18th and the 19th century copies were always dependent on sweeping the cars away into big sort of rear courts where you had huge expanses of hard surface and the perfect kind of environment for flash flooding. So we had gone down a complete blind alley in the hunt for some kind of sort of culture war. And I think it's really interesting that, the awards just essentially ignored that for a period of time and have kept promoting the concept that the benefit comes from the environment in which you live, not what it looks like.
Yeah, I think what I found interesting, I've only been privileged to be part of the judging panel for the last 2 years, Charlie and Will, and I think that what I found an eye-opener and so refreshing is that out of the, 15, 20 sort of strong panel, everybody looks at a building or a home or dwelling with different eyes. So some people look at landscaping, some people look at circularity space, some people look at the connectivity to the local community, whether that be a village nearby or within the dwellings or the apartment block itself. And what is so fascinating about that, and what I've learned, it's what one would assume, because we all look in things in blinkered eyes. Oh, doesn't that look nice? Oh, I love that fireplace. Or I love this window. When you start putting different context into different things, that's when good design really is amplified. And it's probably what you were saying before, Charlie. When somebody is more prescriptive to say, this is your choice, you can have either A or B, then you're going to choose A or B. when you sort of open it up to a variety of different people who have different views on it, it really opens up the door to say, actually, if I were to design a home or an environment where we're going to live today, what would we do? And that's exactly what we've done with Living Places. We said we're challenging the way we're building homes because we need to, not only because it reduces the CO2, but also the way we're living. And we're all living differently now. And I think that's one thing which I think that the awards really amplify really, really well. It's not to do with that looks lovely and that doesn't. It's actually, why are we in this place? What do our lives look like? And that changes from the urban, dense areas of central London to places like the beauty of Woodstock, where I grew up, about 4 or 5 miles away from that. And you have those different sort of yin and yangs, really. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it's really, really fulfilling.
This is so good to hear. I mean, I've been talking about climate change since I was 15 and working in the industry for the last 20, 25 years. And I wonder, like, this sounds brilliant, the Housing Awards. I didn't know anything about the Housing Awards before we talked about doing this podcast. Are the big builders focusing enough attention on the housing design in the UK on the back of these, do you think?
It's a good question. The challenge, if I can just refer to Living Places again, if I may, and just explain exactly what that is, and I put some context in on this. In Denmark, we, with Effect Architects, a leading architectural firm and Artilia contractors, came up and we took a standard house and we measured that, and we measured all the embodied carbon within that. And that metric was about 11.1, whatever that 11 means. And we thought we can build differently by utilizing roof and just building and using different choice of materials. And we reduced that down to 3.8. And the best way of describing that, Will, is that if you were to go down to your local supermarket, you probably go down the healthy aisle. I'd probably go down the less healthy aisle. But you go down the healthy aisle to choose your ingredients for supper or dinner or whatever you're eating. We can do the same in construction. The materials they chose get to that index of 11, and then we then chose different materials, and we brought that down to 3.8. In GB&I, it's 70.
What's GB&I?
Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
I can't say UK, you see, because we're losing out there. But yeah, I think what's quite interesting is that what our challenge is that, without sounding so too arrogant, but going back to our founder saying one experiment is worth more than 1,000 expert views, we can do it because it's been done. The context that we have and the challenge we have, and hopefully answering your question, is that was down to the Danish building standards. So the Netherlands have taken that concept, that methodology, and forget about what the architecture looks aesthetically, but they're taking that methodology of good design and applying that to the Netherlands. And we've just gone out to do similar stuff in the Ukraine. And part of my role now is to amplify this Living Places to say, and the challenge to the construction industry and house builders specifically, what can we do over here? Can we reduce that down and, challenge the kind of things? And when you apply some of the things that sort of we look at in the Housing Design Awards, then it's something that is hopefully can be done and achieved.
Richard, it's very exciting to hear you mention embodied carbon. We had a podcast with a guy a few months ago who runs a low carbon developers, and he has an amazing statistic, which is that Oxfordshire has 100,000 houses slated for building by 2050. Current PLC developer house will produce between 180 and 200 tons of CO2 in its life cycle. If you times the Oxfordshire number of new houses by the current way we're building houses, that uses up 90% of the entire carbon allowance for the entire county of Oxfordshire before you've heated the existing homes, upgraded the existing homes, or even the people living in those new homes have eaten anything. We have got a massive challenge that, unfortunately, the developers and totally the government, who should be leading the way on this, do not seem to be cogent of. And the fact that we've now got the talk about 1.5 million houses in a parliament is exciting and brilliant, but fills me with dread. How much has embodied carbon been a subject that you've seen being tackled through some of the houses and the awards that you've given?
I'm not too sure specific on the awards we've given, but on the Living Places aspect, if you look at the foundations as an example, this is one example, of course, because of the geology is different. It could be different in Oxfordshire than it is in London. It could be in Scotland. But we used as an example, a screw pile foundation as opposed to concrete, and that reduced that carbon by 92%. So that's just changing one thing. And so if we look and challenge that and go to developers, say, actually, if we look at these fundamental things and try to build differently, and yes, the majority, well, we did it in sort of timber, basically. And I know that sometimes sort of timber over here is not used as much as perhaps we could do. I think that will have a major effect. But I think we have to sort of change the whole aspect holistically of how we look at that, because those stats you gave, Charlie, are really alarming when you look at one county, really. So I think what we sort of try to do here is just highlight that. And I think also what the Housing Design Awards do for ourselves, it's understanding what architects have as challenges. And I think a lot of the architects I come across, it's not the appetite they wish to do it, it's the frustration and the legislation that prevents them doing certain things is become more of a challenge. So as an example, as I mentioned before, that we want to increase more daylight into our homes, but yet overheating is a big thing. So the industry is saying, well, actually, when you do your calculations, you need to reduce the glass. But interestingly, when you look at other places throughout Europe, Milan, Barcelona, Madrid, everybody has external shutters. And so it is possible that we can do those things. It's just that at the moment, we haven't chosen to do that in our society. But I think that they're the kind of small steps that we need to do.
Just before we dive back into the episode, I wanted to quickly share something that might interest you, especially if today's conversation has got you thinking about your own sustainability work. Some of the things we hear most in this industry are, I wish I could connect with other people doing this work, or I'd love to turn my sustainability expertise into something more. Well, Green Element, the sponsor of this podcast, have created their own ambassador network, and it does exactly that. This isn't about selling you something, it's actually about helping you make money while building the sustainability community we all need. So, here's what's in it for you. First, you get to join a genuine community of sustainability experts who share knowledge, refer work to each other, and solve problems together, so no more working in isolation. Secondly, there's real money involved. There's a 10% commission on software referrals, and 5% on consultancy work. We're talking about projects that go from £1,000 right up to $100,000. Plus, you'll be able to boost your presence by taking part in our fireside chats. I've actually got an email in front of me from Louise Stevens, one of the ambassadors, and it says that all her clients are genuinely happy because she's got a great partner and her clients love them. But here's the bigger picture. You'll be helping accelerate the sustainability transition that we desperately need. Every referral, every connection, every collaboration moves us closer to the world we're all working towards. If this resonates with you and you want to earn some extra income, click the link in our show notes to apply to become a Green Element ambassador. Okay, back to the show.
Can I just respond as well to that? I think increasingly the private rented developers are beginning to reuse buildings. So there was a time when we had, industrial heritage, magnificent mills. Some of them looked like cathedrals, and these were often converted into private sale apartments. The more complex ones, or the ones that were in poorer locations, or the ones that potentially weren't quite as good buildings, they just stood there continuing to rot. Well, the private rented sector operators have got a model that allows them to take those on. As a company that's won 3 awards in the last 4 years, Capital and Centric, based in the north of England. They're doing schemes in places like Manchester and Sheffield. They're taking on, in the particular case of the winner last night, Eyewitness Works, what was a Sheffield cutlery workshop, and converting that into a really interesting private rented sector building, using all the variety of spaces that you would find in a 3 or 4 story factory building to create something that's got a lot more sort of serendipity to it than any kind of new build extruded glazed box. And that's great, because obviously we know that all these big glazed boxes have got huge heating loads, while some of these more solid and more sort of dense block buildings from the 19th century I mean, they are not going to bounce with the same temperatures because they've got a thermal mass that will control heat gain.
So, in other words, creative reuse of existing is a good starting point. But we need. I mean, there's a huge amount of office space that is now becoming idle because the workspace demands has dropped, certainly at the peak, by about 40%, hadn't it? From what I've heard, might be because of different working patterns. So we've got enormous amounts of buildings that we could be reusing. Is that the point you're talking about in terms of reusing those efficiently and well means that we can significantly reduce embodied carbon in provision of homes?
Well, I think the point in particular I'm making is that there are parts of every city that had a low reputation with estate agents that made it more difficult for market sale builders to convert things like industrial buildings because of the fact that they knew that the surveyors would warn off people to pay the kind of prices that were needed. So you would often find a mill in a beautiful valley in, say, somewhere like the Cotswolds would be converted into, say, retirement apartments. No one had a problem with it because the local value sustained that conversion. But you look at, say, something like a cutlery shop in an area of Sheffield that is not considered to be prime residential, and it was more difficult for a market sale builder to convert that building. The PRS operators, they have a different financial model. They can take on those buildings so they can regenerate and provide new housing in streets where the market sale operators couldn't. And that means more of these existing stock will get recycled rather than demolished. And I think that's a positive aspect.
PRS being private rented.
Yeah. So imagine companies that are building almost exclusively to rent. The Eyewitness Works, it's 97 apartments. In fact, 3 of them are townhouses. It's a factory building in the middle of Sheffield. It's actually right next to the local power station. Any estate agent would have told one of the big house builders, don't even think about it. You'll never get more than £200 a square foot in this place. But a private rented sector developer will take it on and they will turn that into apartments that can be rented at £1,000 per calendar month. And they will retain almost the entire building and use all of its interesting features because that's going to be how they market it. They're going to, if it's got a graffiti on the outside of the building, as the Eyewitness Works has, that graffiti will become part of the marketing.
So in terms of the wider sort of new build schemes that you're seeing, has there been a focus and a kind of a communication to you, the award panel, about what they're doing to try and tackle embodied carbon? Yes, there's a certain amount of brownfield of buildings that we can repurpose, but Labour have been very clear, the new government have been very clear that we are going to build a lot of new housing. Are we seeing that coming through the awards? Is the awards reflecting that in the new build sector?
The new build sector has got a variety of different ways of dealing with its carbon footprint. I mean, obviously, one of the first ones is the performance of the building. But I mean, I personally am encouraged by the way that elements of designs are being borrowed. They don't tend to copy the Housing Design Award winners en masse. It's difficult because they're building houses for sale at a market price point, which means that some of the complexities that you would see in a Housing Design Award winner would require a build cost that wouldn't work inside their model. But what they do tend to do is they recycle ideas. So they cherry pick some of the more exciting creature comforts that are coming through in the latest designs. So they're aware of the fact that people really enjoy having a private outdoor terrace. There are very good reasons for that. You can't sit in the garden and sunbathe in just your bikini bottoms if you're in the traditional housing layout, because your neighbors are going to be quietly watching you from the first floor bedrooms. You can, if that terrace is built into the plan of the footprint of the house on the second level. And so, concepts like that get recycled. And then those houses have got private outdoor spaces, which work not only just for, the point I made joking about sunbathing, but I mean, people who have to cover themselves up in the street because of their cultural issues, what do they do when they get home? They can't sit in the garden and suddenly throw off the clothes that would expose those elements of their body which they're not allowed to culturally because their neighbors can see them. But if they have a private terrace, first or second level, no one's looking down on them. They're completely private. And so those kind of sort of elements do get recycled on the grounds that they give you a particular advantage. but not the design per se, the individual advantage. It's like, cross ventilation strategies. People are realizing that houses that will convent themselves are a really good idea. And so we're seeing more and more schemes which are built with a relatively shallow plan and an ability to actually pass with the hot air through at night, so that you get a little bit of a breeze and essentially people can actually keep cool, because people are aware that these kind of single aspect rooms with no ventilation strategies are increasingly uncomfortable. There's a huge percentage of housing in England built in the last 10, 15 years that is almost uninhabitable on the hottest days now.
I mean, that's exactly the thing that Class O is trying to tackle, isn't it? The new building regulation strategy. You talked about the model not allowing for high quality design. And by that, I mean the loosest sense, as in not just what it looks like, but these features that we're talking about that make it cheaper to run, healthier to live in, better for the environment. But do you not think that right at the heart of the housing provision in this country, we have an issue that developers expect 20% plus profits, whereas in Europe, they would be expecting maybe a third to a quarter of that. And then until we can sort of actually start driving the sort of, I dare I say, greed, and you might argue there's a very good reason for that, traditional greed or the traditional allowance of people operating at 20+% profit, we're not going to get the housing that we want, given that Tesco run at 4.5%. I know it's a slightly different industry, but there's some big challenges here, aren't there, that I'm not sure that we're totally tackling and that the government certainly explicitly aren't tackling. Do you have any response to that?
Yeah, it's a good point. If I could maybe just inject on that or comment, if I may there, Charlie, because I think that if you look at what we're building today, we're building because we're building to make money.
Yeah.
And that's it. And if you go back into history and if you go back into the farming culture or whatever, the landowner would then create some farm cottages for the estate for people to live and work specifically for their jobs they were doing. As an example, if you go to Bourneville, the Cadbury factory, or was Bourneville then Cadbury, the factory owner built an environment for the workers to live within, which was quite lovely. There was open spaces and the homes were quite desirable. And I guess if we look at now society, and I don't have the answer for this, of course, but let's say, for instance, there's a big Google building going up, and I don't know the answer to this, but are we taking into consideration where those people who are going to live, who are going to work in that environment kind of stuff? So I think now the foresight now has been funneled out. And if you go back into history, we're building buildings for people to live in for longevity, which is hugely sustainable because the house that still stands today is still standing. And when you look at our housing stock, homes built which are still standing prior to World War II is 9.4 million, which accounts for 38% of our building stock are still standing. So we've built really good houses. And now we're putting up houses which do they have the same lifespan? And also, what are we doing with industry to build the place where we're living? I think the whole concept has changed. I think that's one thing that we need to challenge.
David, how do you respond to that? Because I mean, it does feel to me that the Housing Design Awards are fantastic in trying to lead the way, but until we sort of tackle some of the bigger issues behind housing, we are not going to get the wonderful examples that you are celebrating to the outskirts of Banbury or Birmingham. And I, do you think there's a fair point there, or do you think that's unfair and that we're actually starting to see much better housing across the board?
Well, I mean, essentially, it's supermarkets versus corner shops. We've got dominant players that are like supermarkets. They build because they have a machine that knows how to use the whole process of development in the UK, from who the landowners are, how the planning authorities work, right the way through to who the local market is and how much they can afford. They're actually extremely efficient. They make a lot of money, but they're also very clever. And I have a great deal of respect for them. What I don't like about them is the fact that there is an innate sort of need to make 20% every year, because of the fact that in about the 7th year, they're going to have a cycle crash and they're going to lose an absolute fortune. And so the only way they can get the city and the pension funds to retain their shares is to make a very high level of profit for most years to cover the fact for several years that there'll not be any. And that's the way the world works in house building. What we've got, though, is some amazingly small retailers. We've got a hugely inventive sector producing around about 10 to 20% of our housing. And what I would say is that, we may not see such exciting designs everywhere, but increasingly we see some of the best housing in Europe. And if you go to Cambridge in particular, you will see that Cambridge is essentially a laboratory for lots of different ideas, where they have reinvented lots of different things to the point where Cambridge is now not only the place that wins the most housing design awards over the last 10 years, they've actually won more than most big cities in Britain combined, but they also are building at a very high rate because they've been very inventive in the product. So they're using all these kind of techniques for development. And the house types I referred to with the terraces built inside the plan of the actual house. So you have these sort of private courtyards and private terraces. Those are built by large house builders in the Cambridge area because they're they're intelligently recycling some of the ideas they've seen in the Housing Design Awards and thinking, how can we do something with this that really works as a product? Now that might spin out, and you might see that further upfield. But I think the end result is generally you'll see innovation in the smaller operators, and they invent the ideas that then get recycled as components in bigger schemes.
You talk about Cambridge, and Cambridge is an amazing example. How much of that is, obviously it's a wealthy area with a lot of growing economy, but how much of that is actually to do with an enlightened planning department and local city council? Because the differences between Oxford and Cambridge in terms of economics are not vast, and but the quality of housing outcomes are, to my mind, very different. And I live very close to Oxford, and I'm a big fan, but Cambridge seems to be streets ahead. So what is government doing, especially as this is a government organized, initiated award, to actually try and get to the roots of why are some places delivering good houses and other places delivering bad? I mean, are these awards being used as a mirror to start asking questions about local councils?
The fact that Cambridge is building I think Cambridge has got something like 0.3% of the population of about 150,000. It's actually building 3% of our new stock. It's outpunching at an incredible level. The government spotted that. It's worked out that it's producing quality as well as numbers, and has commissioned a report that actually was released this summer, which is investigating exactly what the device is that Cambridge has got. And in fact, the reality is a lot of it's to do with the local authority, but it also set up an oversight panel of housing experts who essentially look at the designs, many of which are very pioneering and potentially could fall flat on their face, and asks this panel, what do you think? Do these things fly? Now, subconsciously, it's actually copied what the original process of the awards was, because the awards right back in the 48 and all through the 50s and the 60s, they had people who were sociologists and health researchers investigating whether these designs were actually going to give people things like depression or diphtheria. And they looked at it from an angle of risk. And Cambridge has got this expert quality panel that oversees all the interesting and quite radical designs, and just gives some feedback and says these might not work, these probably will work. And I think that is essentially a planning process replicating the Housing Design Awards process.
That's brilliant to hear. And I think, as probably one of the outsiders of your industry in this podcast, it's absolutely amazing to hear about what is going on with regards to the awards and what impact you're having. And Richard, you're working for a Danish Scandinavian company. It must be really interesting because if I'm honest, I'm pretty disenfranchised with the housing world in the UK. I don't think we're particularly good. I may be wrong, but I just, from reading, my understanding, and that's why I'm really liking what I'm hearing from you guys. But it must be quite a dichotomy between because you hear very good things coming out of Scandinavia and Velux in particular, and your living worlds stuff as well. And I just wonder how you marry the two together.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're a global organisation, and VE is from ventilation and Lux is from light. So it's all about healthy living. And I think what our challenge has been when we're sort of trying to not promote, endorse, but just amplify our message on living a better environment. Because we've got such a strong brand, they think of the product, but we take a step back and say, actually, there's far more to that. We need to build differently. We need to have, in our case, challenging what the industry is doing. And there's continuous improvement is one of our core objectives within our organization. And we actually live and breathe what we do. So as an example, in Denmark, in our offices, when you have your food, we have our own allotments. So they grow their own food for their canteen. And then the waste food goes in and it goes into whatever this machine is, creates mushrooms. It's incredible. So they actually do what it is on the sort of tin. And the challenge we have, and hopefully in answer to your question, that yeah, it's more than a roof window. It's what we're sort of trying to do is challenge the industry, and without sounding too arrogant, as I mentioned, we've done 30 experiments, and we learn from those. Some are good, some are bad, some are indifferent, and we can say, well, we built one, go and live in it, and we've done it, kind of stuff. If you like it or loathe it, but we've done it. But it's not up to us to. We're not the experts in that. We've done it. We've got other people like effect architects engaged in this, and we've done it because we can do it. And so, therefore, our challenge to the industry is to say, please, Mr. Architect or Mr. House Builder, can you do it? Just to re-endorse on that, I think the challenge was not really a sort of challenge. We're challenging the industry. And I think that's a really, really good way of doing it. And the Danish are always looking at sort of different things. And I'm really proud. My background, as I mentioned before, brought up in the Cotswolds and worked as an architect technician. But that's when we had tracing paper, razor blades, and rotary pens. But it's moved on significantly from then. And but I've been with the organisation over 30 years now, and there's a good reason for that. And I think that not only on product development, but I think that the industry development. And I think what I find interesting and alarming at the same time is other countries, like I mentioned beforehand, the Netherlands, or now engaging with Ukraine, and they're far quicker at reacting to housing and way we do things and work in a different world. And that's where, at the moment, passive house is, like I say, sealing everything in. But we've tried to turn into active house principles where we're opening everything up. And there's three elements to that. There's one, comfort, the other is energy, and the other is environment. And there's different parameters within that. And I think that that's something that I'm proud to be part of and proud to amplify to different architects and different house builders per se, to say, come on, it's being done elsewhere. We've got a great industry here. Let's do it.
I beg to differ slightly with the passive house thing. I'm quite a convert to mechanical ventilation heat recovery with proper venting design. But where do you see the awards going, David? You talked a lot about biodiversity and about green space and biophilia being the kind of the big themes of this year's awards. But Richard and David, take it in turns. Where do you see the big next peak of housing is, or the next opportunity?
I think the key thing is health. I think the first time really that we've been living in an environment where people talk all the time about mental health, how you get better mental health outcomes, how you effectively stay happy. And I think the key thing really is we're beginning to understand. There was a series of essays that were written by journalists called Linda Geddes based on various bits of research called Chasing the Sun. And she highlights in 10 different research projects the relationship between actually getting daylight in your home or in your living day and not, and what happens and how the two worlds effectively diverge. Submariners, they all die in their 40s. Young women in Dubai living in apartments with no outdoor space, they all get cancer in their 30s. It's really shocking, this stuff, and the mental health outcomes and the way you can improve those just by introducing a sense of well-being into the place where you're probably going to spend most of each of your days is actually the big benefit from getting housing design right. So last night's winner, the winner of winners, the overall winner, the one that all the judges loved, It's actually a senior housing scheme. It's intended 57 apartments for people who have to be 65 to access it. It's social rent, it's low-cost housing. It's a wonderful scheme if you can get into it. But it's designed to design standards that target daylighting. And that's because there was a panel for innovation for older people about 12 years ago. And it basically said, if you're going to design senior housing, you want to keep them happy, you want to keep them away from the medical provision that costs so much, then make their environment one that supports their mental health. Get them talking to their neighbours in lovely sunlit areas within the development. It does all that. It does it actually in a way that when you visit it, you feel the benefit of standing in those areas. And I think that kind of understanding of how you get better mental health outcomes and how that reduces the burden on the state through designing in the features that actually give people a sense of well-being is a big, big feature now in the Housing Design Awards.
It's fascinating. I'm going to just say, years ago, I saw a German architect who designed a bank building in Holland, and they took 3 different bits of the bank and they brought it together into one place. And it cost 10% more to build this building, and it was natural ventilation, loads of daylight, green roofs, all that kind of stuff. And they did some post-occupancy analysis, and they found that they got a 10% improvement in efficiency because people were not ill, they worked better, and they didn't leave their jobs. And you think, oh, that's brilliant. That's like 10% uplift in productivity for a 10% improvement, extra cost to build the thing. It's only when you go back and look at life cycle cost analysis of an office building, 80 to 90% are wages. So they got 1,000% return on investment to make it a better place to work, because ultimately your office is the best tool you've got for productivity and happiness. And it's the same thing for housing. And it's extraordinary that it's taken us so long to get to this point. But, again, exciting that you're identifying that and seeing an uptick in that area. Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Richard. So that's it for this episode of Sustainability Solved. Will, what did you make of all of that?
Amazing. I can't believe how long they've been running for. Like you said in the intro, since the first sitting of the NHS, that's pretty phenomenal. Quite heartwarming, I think. I'm still, if I'm brutally honest, quite skeptical. I think, if we've got to get this into the main house builders sooner than later, and how do we do that? Your question about Cambridge and Oxford, when you were discussing that, and the fact that you were asking if the government looking at it from a mirror, I thought was a brilliant question. Absolutely brilliant question.
Did we get an answer? I think we did. I think we got a good answer. I think the fact is that, it is about illustrating best practice. I mean, I think there are things that are moving in the right direction. What I find deeply concerning is that it's just not quick enough. There's no urgency. Yeah. And we know that the next decade is absolutely critical in tackling climate change, and that we know housing and construction industry is a disproportionately large impact on our climate. And it feels to me that hoping that some awards are going to change this massive behemoth, this oil tanker of an industry that is really causing significant environmental impact and creating, in my opinion, a substandard product that is putting wider cost onto a society. I think we need to see some massive innovation. We need to see some massive government intervention. I mean, the fact that, and David was, he gave a reasonable answer, and this is the answer that is out there. The large house builders make over 20% profit per year, 24, 25, 26, sometimes 30% when you include some of their internalized costs. I mean, that is just off the charts for any other industry, like literally off the charts for any other industry. As I said, Tesco's 4.5%, 5%. Now, part of that, and he set that out, is that because you have this boom bust cycle, right? So you've got a boom bust cycle, but we need all this housing. So we need to get society. That's what council housing did, is it created a longer term supply. So government needs to realize that this idea of a free market in housing has completely failed, in my opinion. I think David made a reasonable defense that we have some small scale, high quality delivery, but it is very small scale. I mean, it is literally the cherry on top of a very unflavored cake. It's not I'm not sure that's a brilliant analogy, but it's a kind of a little few bits of light in a pretty dark room, in my opinion. And I feel that the government's ambition to tackle 1.5 million new houses in the next parliament is actually delivering more houses than were built in the parliament when the awards were set up. So straight after the Second World War, all of that manpower coming back from the front, all of that manufacturing capacity, no biodiversity net gain, no real care about a lot of other things other than just building houses, 1.3 million. We're trying to go to 1.5 billion. So I don't think anyone should underestimate the challenge we've got. And I don't think you can just tweak the system we've got to deliver anything other than a disaster.
I think one of the things that strikes me, and we've done a few episodes now where I've actually been much quieter because you are the expert in this area, but listening to people, and I think you've asked some pointed questions to people, not only David and Richard in this episode, but other episodes that we have done within the housing sector. And I get the impression that people are scared of the big house builders because there was a couple of things that mainly David actually said, Richard alluded to, but they didn't want to badmouth the big house builders. And I think they've got too much power in the UK. I think you look at what's going on with regards to the government, they won't totally put up a mirror against the housing awards. They're paying for the housing awards, but yet they won't. So what on earth is going on in the UK and it's not just the two guests we've just had, but it's been other people that we've talked to. They will not say the house builders are shit. They won't say it. They won't say it. So that's why we won't change. And that's the problem that we have.
Yes. People won't target it because it is a system that ultimately has paid in large parts for the Tory party to be in power for the last 14 years. So guess what? They weren't going to throw stones at it. They were the construction area was the largest donor to the Tory party. So for 14 years, no one's been really throwing those stones. These 8 companies build about 60% of the housing. But those 8 companies are fundamentally, not you, I suspect, because you have an ethical pension plan, but a lot of people have stocks and shares in these companies. So they are almost like the banks. They are too big to fail. Okay.
Yeah.
And we have created a system also where if they're delivering all the houses and they turn off the supply, that's really bad politically for a government. But ultimately, they can't build anything unless we let them build. So the relationship has got so completely, it's like Stockholm syndrome, right? The government has fallen in love with the people that are basically hostaging them. So when we were supposed to have low carbon, zero carbon building regulations, 2016, this is carbon neutral housing. The big house builders spent a lot of money saying, no, we will not do that. And it's estimated they spent about 40 million lobbying against additional environmental features, which has saved them about 16 billion.
Yeah.
That's a bloody good investment, 40 million.
Yeah.
If you don't give a crap about the planet, throwing 40 million at lobbyists and MPs' holidays to get 16 billion back off your bottom line. Bloody hell, man. You got it. That's when David said, these are very efficient people. They are, right? But ultimately, therefore, we need to use their efficiency and their ruthlessness in better ways, is my opinion. And they're not evil people at all. That's ridiculous. No. That's a ridiculous caricature. Yeah. But they are working the system that is in front of them. And unfortunately, the government are not standing up to them. And I do believe it can be done better. And this is a kind of if anyone is listening who has got a phone call to Andrea Rayner or any of the people in the new Labour government, please just tell them you're not going to make this system work by tweaking the knobs. You need to pull the system apart and really, really challenge the assumptions that underpin it. Therein endeth the sermon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, dude. I care a lot about this.
No, absolutely. And I think possibly many of our listeners will. And so therefore, I wonder if you want to carry on the conversation, head on to sustainabilitysolved.org and carry on the conversation within our community platform where we are discussing the podcast and we're talking to people and we are trying to solve the problems that we are all facing. And if you know anyone that wants to sponsor the podcast and wants to get their logo and brand in front of this absolutely brilliant communication machine, then please email us at podcast@sustainabilitysolved.org. So you really enjoy sustainability and want to be a part of the solution. Come and join our vibrant community. Now, book a call and we can talk more.